one of your friends' loved ones dies or moves away, goes somewhere, and the guy is distraught, one of the things you say in order to comfort that person is, yes, this is not a good thing, but you'll survive, you'll live, and life moves on, and it happens. You say it has happened to other people. You say these kinds of things as a way of comforting others, but then it happens to you, and you say, "Oh my gosh, it's the end of the world." Like, well, no, it's not the end of the world. Just like it is not the end of the world when it happens to somebody else, it's also not the end of the world when it happens to you. And so Epictetus says you will be well served to remember the advice that you give to your own friends when things actually happen to you.
Hello, Massimo. Nice to meet you, man.
Nice meeting you. Nice to be here.
I wanted to start by asking you, what drove you to start practicing Stoicism?
A midlife crisis. Pretty much, which is not unusual for people reached a certain age. In my case, actually, it happened a little early. I was in my late 30s, very early 40s. Typically happens a little later. But, you get to a point where you have a certain career. Like I had a successful academic career as a biologist. And I started asking myself, but is this what I want to do for the next 20, 30 years? And the answer was no, not really. And then shortly thereafter, a kind of a number of things happened, somewhat stressful thing happened, like, divorce, my father dying, changing job in city and buying a new house. Any one of those things, any psychologist would tell you is stressful. If they happen all pretty much simultaneously, like in my case, they happen in the span of a few months, then they really take a toll on you. So, okay, I was going through this, and I figured, well, I need some kind of framework that helps me get through this phase of my life. And I reached for the framework that I thought I had, which was secular-humanism. So stepping back for a second, when I was growing up, I grew up in Italy, in Rome, and I was kind of by default a Catholic, right? Because you grew up literally around the corner from the Pope. So, my family was mildly Catholic, not extremely observant, but nevertheless, that was the thing. But when I got to my teenage years, I started asking too many embarrassing questions and he did not really have a lot of good answers. And so I basically left the church. I said, I don't think this is for me. And as many of my friends at the time, I embraced something called secular humanism, which is a secular philosophy based on humanistic values. It's all about justice and human rights and things like that. Great. So I consider myself a secular humanist for a couple of decades, and then the crisis hit, and I found out that secular humanism was entirely unhelpful, because when you are in the middle of a divorce and your father is dying and all that sort of stuff, the fact that you believe in justice and human rights doesn't actually help. It's a great idea. I mean, I still believe in justice and human rights, but in terms of practical, philosophy of life, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually, help out. So I actually embarked. By that time, I was studying philosophy professionally. I went back to school. I decided that my second career was going to be philosophy, so I went back to school. I got my Ph.D. in philosophy, and so I figured, well, if the answer is going to come from anywhere, that's going to be philosophy, right? And so I really carefully and purposefully started taking a look at some philosophies of life, starting out with Buddhism, for instance, and then moving on to the philosophy of Aristotle, which is a type of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics focuses on character development, on becoming a better person. So I said, okay, that sounds about right. I also looked at Epictetus, but for one reason or another, these things did not really satisfy me. Either they were not really talking to me, they were not, it was not clicking, or they were a little too esoteric, or they were a little too theoretical. One way or another, it just wasn't working. And then one day, I was looking at my Twitter feed, and I saw this thing that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I said, why the hell is anybody celebrating Stoic Week? It's like, what's going on here? Because, of course, I had an idea at the time that the Stoics were these people who go through life with a stiff upper lip and trying to suppress emotions, right? Like, a little bit like Mr. Spock from Star Trek. And I said, surely that's not a philosophy of life. That's not a viable philosophy of life. But it turns out that then I remember where I said, wait a minute, before you dismiss it, the Stoics, one of the Stoics was Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. And I did read his meditations, his book, when I was in college. And I found it kind of interesting. And also another Stoic was Seneca the Younger, who was a senator and the advisor to the Emperor Nero. And I actually translated Seneca from Latin when I was in high school. And so, but I actually never put the two together. I never actually put Marcus Aurelius and Seneca together in the same sort of ballpark. And so I said, okay, well, that sounds actually, it could be more interesting than I thought. So I gave it a try. I signed up for Stoic Week and I practiced, I downloaded material. I started out reading about the Stoics and practicing some of the Stoic meditations and exercises. And immediately it hit me. That was the right thing. That clicked. I kind of heard the click at the back of my mind. And in particular, because I discovered a major Stoic philosopher that I never heard of before, despite the fact that that I had a Ph.D. in philosophy. and I actually took courses in ancient philosophy during my Ph.D. And that guy was Epictetus. And Epictetus was a slave who grew up in Hierapolis, which is in modern Western Turkey. He was brought to Rome by the personal secretary of the Emperor Nero. He was given, since he was a bright guy, he was given opportunity to study philosophy. He did. He learned about Stoicism. Eventually, he was freed. He became a major Stoic philosopher. He became also very annoying to a later emperor, Domitian, who sent him into exile, because the Stoics had this thing that I actually find very appealing, that they spoke truth to power, as we would say today, right? So they were openly criticizing emperors who were tyrannical. So Epictetus was sent into exile to northwestern Greece. He went there, reestablished his school, which became one of the most famous schools of antiquity. And the guy has an incredible sense of humor, bordering on sarcasm. He's a no-nonsense kind of guy. He tells you what he thinks, and it's very clear what he thinks. He uses very clear, very accessible language. So Epictetus and I immediately became friends, and that's how I got into it.
That's amazing. And now you've written a field guide to a happy life, where you basically update Epictetus' famous book, Enchiridion. Yes. Do you mind explaining how famous this Enchiridion book really is?
Yeah, it's a great question, because so most people today have never heard of Epictetus, right? Just I didn't. I hadn't until I enrolled for Stoic Week. But Epictetus was actually a household name for most of the last 18 centuries. As I said, in the early 2nd century, his school was the most prominent, arguably, school of philosophy in the ancient world. A later emperor, Adrian, was visited very frequently. The creme de la creme of Roman. I was about to say American aristocracy. Roman aristocracy. That was an interesting Freudian slip. Anyway. The best of the Roman aristocracy was sending their kids to study with Epictetus. So he was very famous in his own time. Later on, he actually never wrote anything. One of his students put together 2 books based on his notes essentially in Epictetus' classroom. One is a large book in 4 volumes called the Discourses. The other one, the one that we're talking about, is the Enchiridion, or Manual, which is a very short book. It's like 53 short sections. Each section is like a few paragraphs long. And the Enchiridion, or the Manual for Life, was actually influential throughout the Middle Ages. It was used by Christian monks as a exercise as a manual for spiritual exercises. So it was very well known throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And even in modern times, like all of the founding fathers of the American Republic, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin, among others, all had a copy of the Enchiridion that they carry with them. Some of the major British early modern philosophers, like Adam Smith and David Hume, also had copies of the Enchiridion. So it was very famous. He kind of went into a little bit of an eclipse at the beginning of the 20th century. It's not clear to me exactly why. In part, probably that has to do with the fact that philosophy became a professional pursuit, very, very specialized, that technical philosophy was taken over by logicians like Bertrand Russell, who were interested in linguistics and in logic, and not as much in ancient philosophy. And so Epictetus and certainly not in practical philosophy. The ancient philosophers that were not very practical, like Aristotle or Plato, were still obviously well studied and well known by everybody. But the practical philosophers, especially the Stoics, kind of disappeared in the background. And so, with the Field Guide to a Happy Life, I wanted to do a couple of things. First of all, this is essentially my personal homage to Epictetus. I just love the guy. He has been my constant guide through my Stoic path. And so I wanted to write a book that essentially celebrated Epictetus and that would hopefully make Epictetus available again and well known again to a broader public. But the other part, the second reason to write a book is because I think that Stoicism needs an update, kind of a version 2.0, if you will. And the reason for that shouldn't be surprising, right? I mean, think about it this way. Stoicism started out in around 300 BCE, the 4th century before the current era. And then it flourished for about 5 or 6 centuries, until the late 2nd century, early 3rd century. Then it got interrupted by the rise of Christianity, just like every other Hellenistic philosophy, Epicureanism, Aristotelianism, etc. So they all got stopped in their tracks, basically, by the rise of Christianity. So they did not have, the Stoics did not have a time to sort of develop gradually, as it happened for other traditions, like Buddhism, for instance, right? Buddhism also started out a little before, like a couple of centuries before Stoicism, but it was uninterrupted for 2.5 millennia. So much so that in modern times, we really shouldn't be talking about Buddhism in the singular. We should be talking about Buddhisms in the plural, because there is a bunch of different schools of Buddhism which evolved over the centuries. That's not the case for Stoicism. There is only the ancient version, and that's about it. So I figured if people want to use Stoicism, as I think they should, as a modern philosophy of life, then we need to do some kind of updating, because after all, 18 centuries have passed between Epictetus and us, and we've discovered a couple of things in the meantime, right? We have modern science, philosophy itself has changed over the centuries, so we need a little bit of an update, and that's what I intend to do with the book, with a field guide for a happy life. It's called the Field Guide because life happens in the field, so to speak, right? So it's supposed to be very practical. And basically, the structure of the book is very simple. There's a little introduction to Stoicism at the beginning for people who know nothing about it and are maybe curious. And then the bulk of the book, it's actually 53 short sections, just as many as the original Enchiridion. And each section, it parallels exactly the original Enchiridion. It talks about the same topics: death, relationship, money, whatever it is, except that the language is updated to the 21st century. The examples are updated to the 21st century, and some of the concepts are updated to the 21st century. I don't agree with Epictetus on everything. I still think his philosophy is very much pertinent today. But of course, there are a few things that I think need to be modified, and that's what I did in the book.
Can you compare the original Stoicism and the Stoicism that you're proposing, Stoicism 2.0? What has been working from the past that you still want to keep? And what do you think needs updating?
Well, I'll give you 2 examples. One thing that works still today, and it's a major reason why I'm calling it Stoicism 2.0 and not something elseism, right? Because if you change things too much, then it's like, in what sense is this a Stoicism anymore? So one example of something that really works, and it's very, very practical and very useful to people. And then another example of something that I think doesn't work and needs to be changed, right? So the first thing, an example of something that works in ancient Stoicism still today is what is sometimes referred to as the dichotomy of control. Epictetus says right at the beginning of the Enchiridion, some things are up to us and other things are not up to us. And then he gives 2 lists, one of things that are up to us, under our control, and another one of things that are not up to us, they're not under our control. And the lists are interesting because he says that under our control are very few things, really. Basically, our considered judgments, our endorsed values, and our decisions to act or not to act. That's it. Nothing else. Everything else, including health, reputation, career, relationships, wealth, all that stuff, it's not under our control. Now, this may sound like a very strange thing to say because, like, for instance, let's take health, right? Now, we're in the middle of a pandemic, as everybody knows. And so health becomes particularly relevant kind of example. So in what sense is health not under my control? I can do all sorts of things to improve and maintain my health, right? In the middle of a pandemic, for instance, I can wear my masks, maintain social distancing, stay home as much as possible, avoid crowds, wipe down my groceries, sanitize my hands, all that stuff, right? And I do on a regular basis, right? That's great. Those are all things that are under my control because those are the results of my judgments, right? And those are the actions that I decide to put into place, right? Mm-hmm. However, the outcome, that is staying COVID-free, that's not up to me because despite all of that stuff, I could still get unlucky. As a biologist, I know viruses are sons of bitches. They're really tough little pieces of crap, and they can get you even if you're very careful, even if you're completely careful, because you're not completely isolated. Even if you do everything right, somebody may sneeze next to you without a mask at the supermarket, and you're done, right? And I have to go out of the supermarket because I have to eat. So there's no, or something may happen that, despite my best efforts, will make me sick. That's what Epictetus meant. He meant that the efforts are up to you. The outcomes are not, right? Now, this is also, by the way, a very common sort of notion that throughout different cultures. You find something similar to the dichotomy of control in 8th century Buddhism, 11th century Judaism, and in 20th century Christianity. Many people have heard of the Serenity Prayer. The Serenity Prayer is something that is adopted by 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, for instance, right? And the prayer, essentially, which was written by a Christian theologian, American theologian at the beginning of the 20th century, essentially asks God the wisdom to tell the difference between the things that we control, that we can change, and the things that we cannot change, and then the courage to change what we can, and the serenity to accept what we cannot, right? Well, that's essentially Epictetus. And it's not by chance. As I said, the Stoics actually influenced Christianity throughout the centuries. Epictetus is essentially saying the same thing. This is very useful still today. Why is it useful? Because you can apply the dichotomy of control almost in everything you do in your life. I just gave you the example of a pandemic, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. But I can give you other examples. Let's say that I go up for a job interview, right? It comes natural to us to focus on the outcome. Will I get the job or will I not get the job, right? Epictetus says that's the wrong way to look at it. What you should be focusing on, because the outcome is not up to you. You are not the one that decides whether you're getting the job or not. Your potential boss is the one or the person who interviews you is the one that makes that decision. And that decision depends on a bunch of factors, many of which are not under your control. Like what kind of competition you have, for instance. There might be somebody more qualified than you are for the job. Or even, completely random things like maybe the interviewer got up on the wrong foot this morning because he had a bad night, or he had a fight with his wife or something like that. So he's in a bad mood and it's going to be a bad interview because of that. So what should you do? Well, you should focus your attention on the things that really are under your control, which include things like preparing well for the interview, putting together the best resume you can, make it so that you actually worked hard so that you really are a good person for that job or a good fit for that job. Focusing during the interview, not getting distracted, not drinking the night before the interview because otherwise you're not going to sleep or you're not going to be, alert, dressing appropriately for the interview, all of that stuff. So those are all your decisions. Those are all up to you, says Epictetus. And those are the only things you should be focusing on. For the rest, in terms of the outcome, you should prepare yourself mentally for the possibility that you may or may not get the job. As we all know in life, sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. Sometimes things go your way, sometimes they don't. And Epictetus basically saying, behave like an adult, not like a child. You don't throw a tantrum if things don't go your way. If they don't go your way, you develop the serenity to accept that result. But at the same time, you also work on the courage to try to do the best thing you can. So that's a very important example of something from ancient Stoicism that still works perfectly today, and it's actually very, very, very useful. I mean, honestly, I cannot overstate how much the dichotomy control changed my life. Once you start practicing it, and once you start, incorporating it into your normal way of thinking, understanding it is not difficult. I just explained it to you. It's very easy. It's a very easy concept. Practicing takes time, because it's not like you just tell yourself, repeat the Enchiridion to yourself, and then say, "Oh, okay, I'm fine." No, you have to internalize. You have to internalize it, right? And that internalizing it does take time and effort. But once you do, it really does change your life. On the other hand, there are things in ancient Stoicism that I think don't translate very well to modern times, and therefore be changed. For instance, the Stoics the ancient Stoics thought that the universe is a living organism endowed with reason, with what they call the logos. Okay, this was important because they thought that we are literally bits and pieces of this gigantic organism, right? And so that whatever happens to us, it's for the benefit of the organism. Now, why is that? This is metaphysics, of course, right? But it has consequences, really important consequences for the ethics, that is, for how we live our life. Epictetus, at one point in the Enchiridion, says, look, you're like a foot that has to step into the mud in order for the body to cross a path and go back home, right? If you think of yourself as just a foot, isolated, with no body that you're connected to, you're going to say, well, this is disgusting. Why should I step into the mud? This is horrible. I don't want to do that, right? But if you realize that you're connected to a body and that it is your duty as part of the body to step into the mud, because otherwise the body doesn't get home, then not only you're going to endure the mud, you're not only going to say, okay, fine, I'm going to do it. You're actually going to be happy, because you're literally doing what you've been made for, right? That you're fulfilling your purpose in life, essentially, as a foot, right? The practical application of that for the ancient Stoics comes when we suffer tragedy or loss. Epictetus says, look, when you lose a friend or your child or your spouse, don't be disturbed. In fact, you should be happy, because it's not that you lost them in isolation. They're gone because this is good for the rest of the universe. And, it may be a loss to you, but you should be actually happy. That's what Nietzsche famously referred to as amor fati, love your fate. Right? So you don't just endure it. It's like, okay, it's a loss. I can't do anything about it. You really so embrace it. Like you love your fate. It's a beautiful idea. It really works very nicely. If you buy into the concept of a cosmic providence. But I don't, because modern science tells us that the universe is not a living organism endowed with reason. We're not bits and pieces of a cosmic logos. The universe is just a set of dynamic processes of which we happen to be part, but there is no rhyme or reason to those processes. It's not like what happens to me or to my loved ones actually helps the universe. The universe doesn't give a crap about what happens. It's neither against me or my favor. It doesn't work either way. It's entirely neutral from a moral perspective. That means that as a modern Stoic, I don't have the luxury of amor fati. I don't have the luxury of loving my fate. If I lose should I lose my daughter or my wife or one of my friends, that would suck. That would be a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
However, so that's why the modern Stoic would say, yes, that it would be a bad thing. That's unlike the ancient Stoics. You don't embrace your fate. You don't love it. But you need to be mentally prepared for it, because you know that death and loss are going to happen. This is a natural thing in life. I've lost, for instance, over the several years, I lost both my parents, right? And I lost them arguably a little earlier than it should have happened, because both of them to disease, both of them to cancer. But I knew that was going to happen. I didn't know when it was going to happen. I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I knew it. It's like they're mortal. They were going to go, and so the modern Stoic says essentially something on the lines of, look, you just need to expect that bad stuff is going to happen to you, because this is the way life is. And at that point, you need to work toward developing an attitude of equanimity, to accept things in a serene fashion. Yes, people die, and that's just going to happen. You're not going to be happy about it, but you're not going to be destroyed by it either, because you know that it's going to happen, and you accept it. You prepare yourself mentally for the moment where that happens. So that's one major difference between ancient Stoicism and the new version that I am proposing. That we lose the amor fati. It's unfortunate, because I would love, honestly, to think that I'm a foot that is part of a living body that is the cosmos itself. But I don't think that's the case.
Okay. And how do you prepare yourself for a relative's death or for your own death? Do you do any practices, any meditations on death?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's a great question. So let's talk a little bit about the practice here. Yes, there's a number of ways that one can prepare oneself for loss, and including, you're right, our own death. Seneca, the first century Stoic philosopher, actually said that death is the ultimate test of our character. Right. That's really when the shit hits the fan, so to speak. And he's like, all right, then now it's me. It's not my parents or my friend or something. It's actually me, right? And of course it's gonna be a difficult moment in our life. And so it certainly is a good idea to be prepared for it. Now, there are different ways of doing that. I'll tell you a couple. One is, there is actually a Stoic meditation. It's called the meditation on death. It can be done in a number of ways. I'll tell you how my favorite way of doing it is. So I live in Brooklyn, New York, and right at the beginning of the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge is just downstairs from my apartment. So when I want to do a meditation on death, I walk downstairs, I cross the bridge, and go into downtown Manhattan. When I get on the other side, not very far from it, I find myself in front of a church called Trinity Church, which is right in the middle of Wall Street. Okay, so it's right at Wall Street, and so it's kind of surrounded by skyscrapers and stuff like that. But it's an old church with a cemetery, right? And so I walk into the cemetery, and I slowly, deliberately pay attention to the graves. I read the names, I look at the dates, and I just absorb this notion that all of those people are dead, and they were once just as alive as I am, just as alive as my friends and relatives and loved ones are, and yet they're there, right? They don't exist anymore. They're on the ground, and so we're all going to go there. Now, you may think that that's kind of depressing, right? But it's actually, I find it, and a lot of other Stoic practitioners find it reinvigorating, because what happens so you contemplate this, you take your time to sort of get your mind used to it. You try to do it not in an emotional way, not as in, oh my gosh, it's going to happen to me as well. But it's like, oh, look at that. That's the name. That's that other name. That's the date. That's the other day. So you try to do it in a detached, kind of objective way of looking at things. And then at the end of the meditation, you get out of the cemetery, right? And you're surrounded by Manhattan. So you're surrounded by skyscrapers, buses and subways and cars and pedestrians and stuff like that. Even in the middle of a COVID pandemic, it still looks like that to some extent, right? So you're snapped back into life. And so part of the notion here is, yes, to acknowledge the fact that you're going to die, and everybody's going to die, but also to reflect on the fact that you're so lucky to be alive right now. And you're so lucky to have loved ones alive, right? And Epictetus has this beautiful phrase that he says, you shouldn't be wanting a fig in winter, figs in winter, meaning that figs are not winter fruits. So if you want figs in winter, you're a fool, because they're not around. But by the same token, they are around during the summer, And so you should enjoy them. You should eat figs as much as possible during the summer because that's when they're around. Same idea for your life and the life of your loved ones, right? It doesn't make any sense to wish that they were alive now if they're dead. Like my father, for instance, right? Well, that's useless. I mean, it's like that's like wanting a fig in the middle of the winter. He's not alive. That's it. I can remember him. I have some good memories of him. But to wish that he were here, it's like it's useless. In fact, it's kind of a negative thing because then it depresses you, and then you be unhappy. But by the same token, while your spouse, your child, your friend, and your parents are alive, you should actually be spending good time with them, enjoying what they are and who they are, precisely because they're not going to be there forever. So that's one way to develop slowly over time a good, positive attitude, or at least a sort of a non-negative attitude toward death. Another Stoic exercise is very important, which actually has broader application. It's not just about death. It's really about pretty much everything, is what we call the philosophical journal. A philosophical journal is, it's described actually by the ancient Stoics themselves. Epictetus talks about it. Seneca talks about it. And essentially consists in journaling about your daily happenings, but in a particular way. So I do it, for instance, almost every night before going to bed. I just open up my computer and I type a few things, a few thoughts about what happened during the day. But this isn't supposed to be a diary, like, oh, today I got out and went to the grocery shopping, or I did this or that or the other. That's not what it is about. You're supposed to focus on things that happened to you where you either reacted very well, particularly well, or you did not handle particularly well. For instance, I don't know, maybe today I got upset with a student and I lost my patient or something like that, right? My patients, or with a friend or whatever. So you reflect on those instances because you're trying to learn and to become a better person. The way you do that, however, a lot of people do it in the wrong way. Lots of people journal, even people that are not Stoic. The journaling is a very common thing. Lots of people do it, but a lot of people do it wrong from a Stoic perspective. A lot of people tend to write in the first person. For instance, I did this, I did that, and they tend to write in a very emotional way. I got upset about this because, God damn it, there was this blah blah blah. If that happened, I was, I was writing being angry, that sort of stuff. That not only doesn't help, it's actually counterproductive. And there is research in modern psychology that backs up the Stoic intuition. That way of doing it is a bad way of doing it. It's actually, you're only making your life more miserable because you're revisiting emotionally some situations that were difficult for you, and then you're now going over and over again. They loop in your mind constantly. That's not good. That's not a good thing. The way you should do it is the way the ancient Stoics did say that we should, and as I said, modern psychologists agree. And that is, first of all, you write in the second person, as if you were writing to a friend. So you say, oh, today you did this. Today you reacted in this way, right? That sort of stuff. As if you're writing a letter of advice to your friend, okay? Except that your friend is yourself in this particular case. The second thing you need to do is to try to describe the situation as objectively as possible. In other words, don't use emotional language. Because the point isn't to relive the situation emotionally. The point is to learn from it and try not to do it the next time around, right? So typically, for instance, Stoics ask themselves 3 questions. What did I do wrong? What did I do right? And what could I do better? And the reason for those are because you want to ask yourself what you did wrong in a particular situation. Let's say, as I said, again, maybe I lost my temper with a friend or something like that, right? Or what did I do wrong? Well, I lost my temper. That was not good. That's not a good thing to lose your temper with your friend. The reason you want to write that down is because you want to analyze how that exactly happened. What triggered you? Why is it that you lost your temper? What was so important that you got angry about? How did that actually happen? And you do that not because you want to self-flagellate and say, oh, I was so bad, blah blah blah, but because you want to learn. And say, oh, so that kind of stuff actually triggers me, turns out, right? You also want to ask yourself, What did I do right? The reason for that is twofold. First of all, pat yourself in the back. Like, okay, I did something right. So I'm not a horrible human being, right? I did something right. Like, for instance, yes, I did get upset, but I immediately apologized to my friend, right? I caught myself and I apologized. And that's a good thing. The second reason you want to write down what you did right is because basically now you have two goalposts, right? You have, on the one hand, the stuff you don't want to do, and on the other hand, the stuff that you want to do. And the goal over time is to move away from the first one and toward the second one, right? So if you keep them in mind, you say, okay, well, certain things trigger my anger. On the other hand, I can also find the resources in me to apologize when I get angry. That's what you want to do. Over time, you want to move away from the first one and toward the second one. So the third question becomes then crucial, because the third question is, how could you possibly handle better that kind of situation in the future? We tend to think of our lives as kind of always varied, you're always doing different things, but that's not true. Pretty much we live the same life every day, right? I mean, you think about it this way. You get up in the morning, you go to work, at least you did before the pandemic, right? And so you see the same people, your colleagues, you do about the same things because, your job is what it is. Then you come back home and you see the same people, your wife or your children or whatever it is. And you tend to do the same things. And then during the weekend, you take the day off and you see your friends and you tend to see the same people again and tend to do the same things. You go to the movies or you go to a concert or whatever it is, or you go to the dinner out again before the pandemic. That means that all these situations repeat themselves. Not exactly, but broadly, right? Which means that if you pay attention to what you've been doing in the past, and you think about it, you can say to yourself, okay, well, next time that something like this happens, I'm going to be prepared. I'm going to react in this other way. So let's say, again, let's use the same example that I gave you a minute ago. Let's say that I wrote down in my philosophical journal that I got upset with my friend, and that's because he criticized the fact that, he says, oh, maybe you're a little bit out of shape. You should go to the gym. And I got upset. Right? Well, if I pay attention, then now I know that is one of my triggers, right? And I can tell myself when to my diet, I can say, dude, why you get upset about this? I mean, there's only two possibilities: that either my friend was right, that it's true that I let myself go a little bit and I should go to the gym, right? In which case, I shouldn't get upset. I should thank him. Mm-hmm. She said, "Oh yeah, thank you for pointing it out. That spurs me to go back to the gym, or to eat more healthy or something like that." Or he's wrong. Maybe it's just he thinks that I put on some weight, but I actually didn't. And I know because I checked myself. I went on the scale and I checked. I said, "No, you're wrong." In which case, if he's wrong, it's not skin off my nose. I mean, he's the one that is wrong, not me, right? So why do I get upset about things? And so I can prepare myself mentally next time that something like that happens, either for the same friend or with somebody else. I can say, look, actually, that's not actually the case. It may look like it, but I actually check myself and I'm in pretty good shape. But thank you for your concern, right? So if I put myself in that situation of thinking ahead of time, how am I going to react the next time, then my reaction is going to be much better. So the philosophical journal can be used for these day-to-day situations, but it can also be used to reflect on the death of a loved one, for instance, right? Or to prepare yourself. Like when my mother got, a few years ago, she was diagnosed with cancer, with terminal cancer. I had plenty of time to write because this took months before she actually eventually died. And I had plenty of time to reflect with myself in my philosophical diary about what was happening, the meaning of what was happening, how I was reacting to it, how I should be reacting. I should be supportive of her. I should be next to her. She lived in Rome, so we were not exact. There was an ocean and a sea, and the Mediterranean Sea between us. So it wasn't that easy to go back, or that obvious to go back. But I tried to do it as much as I could, and the journaling really did help. Because when it happened, I was completely in a situation of acceptance, of knowledge, of understanding. It still wasn't fun. I mean, it was not, it's not a thing that, again, I didn't embrace it. It was not amor fati, but I was ready for it. I was prepared for it. That meant that I did the right things, more or less, with her, with my brothers who were there, with her husband who was there, that I was in a better position. Because I was in a better position with myself, I was also in a better position with other people that relied on me to be helpful, to help with the arrangements for the funeral, for instance, or, to deal with the bills or, whatever it is. If I had freaked out and I had just given myself to depression or tantrum or anything like that, I would not have been helpful to people that were counting on me at the time.
Sounds like a great technique. And my question here is, do you do it do you write you? Because when we reflect on other people's flaws, it's kind of easier to spot them. So if we look at ourselves sort of in third person, it's easier to see what we're doing wrong than when we're writing with I.
That's exactly right. And in fact, as I said, that's how modern psychologists suggest to do it. There is a branch of psychotherapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and which is very popular. It's well supported by the evidence, meaning that it worked, by research, meaning that it works. Not 100% because it's not an exact science, but it works. And interestingly, cognitive behavioral therapy started out in the early 1960s, and it was in fact inspired by Stoicism. The early practitioners of CBT had read Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and so on, and they picked up on these techniques that the Stoics were using, and they, of course, then fine-tuned them. They elaborated on them. But that's why, for instance, a CBT practitioner will tell you that the philosophical journaling, or the personal journaling, as they will call it, is very important, and you do need to do it in second or even third person, but not in the first person, for that exact reason. Epictetus says something interesting at some point when he's explaining this technique. He says, look, when one of your friends' loved ones dies or moves away, goes somewhere, and the guy is distraught, one of the things you say in order to comfort that person is, yes, this is not a good thing, but you'll survive, you'll live, and life moves on, and it happens. You say all it has happened to other people. You say these kinds of things as a way of comforting others, but then it happens to you, and you say, "Oh my gosh, it's the end of the world." Like, well, no, it's not the end of the world. Just like it is not the end of the world when it happens to somebody else, it's also not the end of the world when it happens to you. And so Epictetus says you will be well served to remember the advice that you give to your own friends when things actually happen to you, and that's where that technique arises. That's why you want to do the journaling or the meditation in the second person, as if you were writing or talking to a friend.
That's amazing. I think we've learned a lot. I love the techniques that you've given. Is there anything you want to say or anything you want to promote?
Well, in terms of something to say, I would say, look. Stoicism it's a very interesting, very well thought out philosophy, which comes with an interesting set of sort of guidelines or framework for living your life, exercises, practical exercises, meditations, things like that. It may not be for everyone. I'm not one of those people that suggest that Stoicism is the answer to your questions, but you might want to give it a try. There is a reason why the philosophy survived for like 23 centuries and it's still doing well. Because it resonates with a lot of people. It has a lot of very, very practical advice. As I said, Epictetus changed my life almost instantly, on a overnight. But at the same time, it's a philosophy of life. It needs to be practiced for your entire life, and it's not a silver bullet. It won't give you an immediate answer. It's like the analogy here is like going to the gym, right? So if you go to the gym and you've never been to a gym before, what do you do first? You go to a trainer and you ask about how to use the weights and the machines and what kind of routine exercises you might want to do, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not like the trainer explains things to you and then you walk out and you say, okay, I'm done. now I got my aerobic capacity and muscle tone. I'm good. It's like, no, you don't. That was just the beginning, right? Then you had to go back every day and do the things that the trainer was told you to do. And then, if you persist over weeks and months and years, then you see the benefit. You see some of the benefits immediately, almost immediately. Like a few weeks into an exercise regime, you will feel better. But it will take much longer to actually really reap the benefits. It's the same with a philosophy of life. It will be helpful, I think, immediately. You will feel the difference in terms of how you think about the world. But then inevitably there will also be setbacks. It will take some patience and some practice and some going back. You'll slip back and then you get back to it, etc. So my advice is give it a try and stick with it for a while. I think it has the potential to change your life.
That's great. And when you started, did you go little by little, maybe with one exercise per day? How did you make it a habit to use all these practices in your life?
Yeah, you do a little bit of it at a time. You don't want to be overwhelmed. And there's lots of Stoic exercises. A previous book that I co-wrote with my friend Greg Lopez, it's called The Handbook for New Stoics, and has 52 exercises that you can do. But you don't want to do all 52, and certainly not all at the same time. So what it is, the notion is you sample things. You read, you go through the book, and you sample things. And depending on what your main problems are going to be, there are some exercises that are more useful than others. For instance, if your problem is that you're prone to anger, then there are 3 or 4 exercises in the book that are about anger. If your problem is about anxiety, then there are a couple of exercises that are about anxiety, and so on and so forth. So yes, you pick 1 or 2 to begin with. And then you rotate them perhaps with other exercises if you want to try other things, just like you would do to the gym. Right? You don't try every machine and all the weights in the same time, because then that's going to kill you. You try some until you get comfortable with them, and then you either increase the strength or increase the weights, or you rotate with different kind of exercises, because they're actually working some different kind of muscles that you have. It's the same with Stoic philosophy. You start with 2 or 3 exercises, and then you rotate them with others depending on what life problems you have, depending on what it is that you actually need.
Thank you so much, Massimo. I really enjoyed this talk.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.